In this movie, I'm going to explain a little of the way data moves around with the dynamic website, and how this differs from static web pages that you're probably very used to creating. The different elements that we're going to look at are the user's machine, which is connected to the internet, and the server, in this case an application server, and this differs from a standard web server in that a web server will only serve whatever it's asked for, and the data that's stored on a web server is all completely pre-packaged as HTML pages, or even if the data seems more complex and dynamic, for instance, if it serves JavaScript or Flash movies, all of that is essentially static in that the user simply requests a particular page and gets the content in the form that it's arranged on the server. An application server, however, can run a script when that's requested by the user, and through the inputs that the user has returned to the application server, it can make dynamic and more intelligent choices about the kind of content that the user wants to see. It can work in conjunction with a database server, and although these are usually separate, it's quite possible that there'll only actually be one machine with an application and database server effectively in the same box. But they're different concepts, so even if they are physically together, it's best to look at them as two separate entities. So what happens basically when the user types in the URL of whatever page they're calling on the internet is that the request is passed to the application server, and that's the point at which PHP comes in. The scripts that we run on the application server to allow the content to be served in a dynamic way based on the user's choices and what we know about the user are written in a variety of different scripts. Obvious examples are Microsoft's Active Server pages, which use VBScript and JScript. Other examples would be Perl or Java server pages or ColdFusion. We're looking at PHP, and all of these tools, although they do things, some areas are better than others, they all fulfill this same kind of purpose, running a script on the application server. So this is where the technology that we're going to be looking at throughout this title, PHP, comes in, the scripts that are run on the application server. These scripts may then request, based on the information that's been passed to them by the user, information from the database server. And the database server sends back information to the PHP script, which then serves the data up in an acceptable form to be handed back to the user. Now, all the way through this title, we're just going to be looking at serving pure HTML. It is perfectly possible to serve other kinds of technology, such as JavaScript or client-side scripting through PHP, but typically we're going to be serving up HTML. It's also possible to pass information to a client-side application. For instance, I do a lot of that with Macromedia Flash, sending information from PHP to Macromedia Flash. However, at its simplest form, PHP will serve HTML, which is readable in any browser on the user's machine. A distinction I should make here is between server-side scripting, such as PHP or any of the other technologies I just mentioned, and client-side scripting, such as most typical example would be JavaScript, but other examples would be, these wouldn't be scripting as such, but such things as Java applets that run on the user's browser through the Java virtual machine, or Flash movies. Now these are client-side scripts or applets, and this should not be confused with the job that is done by PHP, which is a server-side technology. So the content is returned via the internet to the user's machine based on their choices and the structure that we set up in our PHP scripts. This is basically how the dynamic web works. In our next movie, we're going to look at the tools that you'll need to start creating your own dynamic web. Now let's take a look at the tools that you'll need in order to become productive with PHP. In our last movie, we looked at the hardware that will be needed to run a dynamic website on the web. For the purposes of development, we can get away without most of this and simply use a single machine with the right kind of software. Let's take a look in detail at the software that you're going to need in order to develop your PHP scripts and to test them out on your machine. First of all, you're going to need some server software. Your choice of server software will depend to a greater or lesser extent on the kind of platform that you're running. The Apache web server runs on both Windows and Linux and a whole range of Unix and GNU systems. There's also Microsoft IIS, which only runs on Windows, and this is also a good product. I wouldn't recommend PWS, Microsoft's earlier personal web server software that shipped, I believe, with Windows 98. PWS has given me no end of trouble, so I recommend that if you go with a Microsoft product, you use IIS rather than PWS. There are also a range of other server software technologies available, such as Zeus, Zatami, and a whole raft of others, but a choice has to be made as to what server you're going to run on your machine. For the purposes of this title, I'm going to be running Apache on my Windows machine. The PHP Engine is the next thing that you're going to need to be running on your machine, and this is available from the PHP website, php.net, and this is available in different flavors depending on how comfortable you are with compiling or installing. You can download the source code if you want to compile it yourself. You can also download pre-compiled binaries available for a whole number of different platforms. And for very popular platforms, there are also installations available that pretty much install themselves. The documentation on the PHP website is pretty comprehensive as regards the different platforms and the installation instructions installing on these different platforms. You're also going to need a text editor to write your PHP scripts with. Now, there are a whole range of different products: EditPad and TextPad for Windows, Notepad that comes free with Windows. There are a number of problems with Notepad, such as its tendency to add the TXT extension to any file it saves, which is not very useful when you're trying to save a PHP script or any other kind of script that requires a specific extension. However, you can use Notepad if you wish. For the Linux platform, there are also such packages as Emacs and Vim. All of them, apart from Notepad, good text editors. I in no way intend to endorse any of these products or recommend any of them. We're going to be using EditPad for the purposes of this title, but you could use any text editor that you wanted. You're also going to need a web browser to preview your work. Now, it doesn't matter which web browser you use. We're going to be using Microsoft Internet Explorer. We could also use Netscape, Opera, Mozilla, or any of a whole range of other web browsers. Because, as we saw in the last movie, PHP scripts are executed on the server, the capacities or capabilities of the web browser are irrelevant to previewing PHP scripts. So long as the web browser works and it can read HTML, then it's satisfactory for our purposes. You're going to need a database management system if you're intending to use your PHP scripts for database connectivity. Once again, it's your own personal preference and needs that should determine which database management system you go for, be it Oracle, MySQL, PostgreSQL, and MS SQL Server. For the purposes of this title, we're going to be using MySQL, which is also available under an open source license for non-commercial use. One other thing that I should add about writing PHP scripts is that while the most common way of doing it is by using a text editor and a web browser, and that works perfectly well, you can also replace both of these with an integrated development environment. Now, there is no particular product that is endorsed by the PHP organization, but there are a number available on the market, such as PHP Coder, that allow for an integrated scripting space and a preview space which effectively integrates a browser into the text editor. If we take a look at our text editor that we're going to be using, we can see that the text is stored in the main window, and if we want to preview what the PHP script will look like when it's run through the web server software, then we have to leave our text editor and go to a browser to check that out. However, if we use a product like PHP Coder and we open up the same file here, as we can see, because this is a PHP specific product, our code has been colored, what kind of script we've entered, and we're also able to use this preview window to test out our script. So the integrated development environment can be a good choice for some users. For the purposes of this title, however, we're going to be using the text editor and browser combination because that's what everyone has, and so it's a good basic standard to work with. I'm now going to quickly run through the knowledge that I expect you to have before you start learning PHP with this title. I'm going to expect you to be very familiar with HTML, and if you're intending to use a database with PHP, then I expect you to know some basic skills in that database so that you can apply what I teach you in these scripts that I'm going to be using as examples to your own database and how that works. A very important thing is that you know structured query language. Now, if you haven't used a database before, or you don't know it, then I should point out that the virtual training company offers a number of titles on databases. I know there's one for Microsoft SQL Server, which will teach you how to use Microsoft SQL Server, and once I finish with this PHP title, I'm going to start on a MySQL title. So if there's not a MySQL title out when you're reading this, or viewing this rather, then it will be out very soon. Finally, you're going to complete your knowledge base with PHP through this title. And once you've done that, you'll know everything you need to know to create dynamic websites. In terms of getting help with PHP, outside of this title, you should download a copy of the manual so that you can look up the different functions and commands of PHP syntax. And as you can see, it gives a very short reference here, but it explains comprehensively all the different functions, but it can't go into very much depth. That's where an introductory guide such as this title comes in and helps you through your learning process as you're getting to know PHP. You should also consider using the online version of the manual. This is available at php.net. And the good thing about the online version of the manual is that PHP users have added to the fairly brief set of instructions included within the main body of the manual, and people are able to post at the bottom here with their views and little insights into the way to use different features of PHP. So the online version of the manual is constantly being updated and added to and contributed to according to the whole spirit of open source software. However, I should also point out that the user contributed notes that we're seeing here are contributed by expert users of PHP and are intended to explain points that are not well enough explained by the official PHP documentation. They are not intended for new users of PHP to post their questions. There are forums available for that kind of thing, such as the excellent phpbuilder.com. And this is a great place to go if you're stuck with a certain thing and you want some kind of advice as to where you can go from there. As you can see, the forum is set up so that users can ask questions and other users can help them out with their problems. Once again, however, it's always best to first of all read the manual, then to go to a site such as PHP Builder and run a search for the question that you want answered, and then finally, if you can't find an answer through doing those things, then post your own question. That's about it for this movie, and in our next movie we're going to have a look at the difference between scripting and viewing. In the last two movies I mentioned the difference between client-side and server-side scripting. A good way to demonstrate this would be to attempt to directly load a PHP file into a web browser without using a piece of server software. All my PHP files are stored within this folder, htdocs. This is the root of the web server that I'm using, Apache. Your document root may look a little different depending on what server software you're running, but all your PHP files should be stored within the document root of your web server. We're going to have a look at enter.php, which is stored within the forum test folder, and we're going to try and drag this directly onto our web browser. As we can see, all the script is echoed directly onto the browser. Obviously not the effect we're looking for. And the reason for this is that the web browser, Internet Explorer, has tried to load the file directly from its location on drive C. However, if we replace this part of the address with the address of our local host, which we can represent either by a numeric value or simply by the word localhost, using forward slashes, something to remember if you're running on Windows, as I am. Then we try to run the file. As we can see, the PHP has been interpreted by the server, and this has been echoed to the browser. Now, if we look at the source, and this is something that we could do if we're using client-side scripting, such as JavaScript, we could look at the source, and then we'd be able to see exactly how this page was put together. However, if we look at the source of this page, as we can see, none of the PHP remains. All we have here is the HTML made to create this page. So the PHP was read by the server when we made the request, processed, and then the only thing that arrived at our browser was the HTML that was served by the PHP script. This is a very important difference that you need to grasp before you move on to start making your scripts. In our next movie, you're going to write your very first PHP script. In this movie, you're going to write your first PHP script. It's not going to be anything fancy. Let's start out by writing the HTML tag, and then the head tag. You'll be familiar with this from HTML. And then we're going to add a title, which simply says my first PHP page. Then we'll close the head section, open up the body section, and here, instead of typing in some normal text, we're going to put in a lesser than sign and a question mark. And we're going to type the echo command, open quotes, hello world, close quotes, and then we need a semicolon at the end, and that's it. That's our script. We close the PHP tag with a question mark followed by a greater than sign, and then we end the body tag and finally the HTML tag. So as we can see, our PHP script, short though it is set like an island into the HTML. Let's save that, and we're going to save that into examples, and that's within the document root folder of our web server, and we're going to save that as hello world.php. Now if we pop over to our browser and load that using the localhost address, we're going to load the hello world PHP script that we've just written. As we can see, hello world has been echoed to the browser. If we take a look at the source of that, as we can see, the PHP script has been processed by the server software, and all that's been output is the text which was output to the browser. That concludes this chapter, and in our next chapter we're going to have a look at some of the absolute basics of PHP. In this chapter we're going to look at the very basics of PHP. We're going to take you through your first steps in writing a PHP script. First of all, we're going to look at the way PHP scripts are embedded within HTML so that they can be served from the server and passed to the user's browser. Then we're going to look at how we declare variables to make our scripts more flexible, and we're going to look at ways to manipulate those variables using operators. And finally, we're going to take a look at some more complex operators and do some more complicated things with our variables. So first of all, let's open up our text editor, and we're going to start with our very first PHP script. We use a PHP open tag to define where our PHP script starts and stops. This is very important, and this example will show you why. To start with, let's write a plain HTML page. And then we're going to try and put some PHP into the body of the page and see what happens. Let's use that line of code that we used in our example at the end of the last chapter for our Hello World script. Now you may spot that there's something wrong with this. So let's see what happens if we try to save that to our document root, which we find in this case in Apache, because that's my local web server, under htdocs. I'm going to put this one in examples, and we're going to call this test.php. So save that, and now let's open up our browser and we'll open this using the localhost path. Now we saw some of the reasons for that in our last chapter, but it's very important that we use the localhost path and not the absolute path via the disk. So, what do we have here? Something's definitely wrong with this. There's the hello world text that we wanted, but here's this echo command is showing up, and the quotes around the hello world, and this semicolon at the end. Now, we didn't want any of that to show up. All we wanted to show was hello world. So what is the reason that this is acted like this when the last time we tried it our script worked? The reason is that we've forgotten to put in our PHP tags. And this is why these are so important. If you put in your PHP tags, then whatever is you write between them is evaluated as PHP code. Anything else is evaluated as HTML. So we could put after that, this is just HTML. And we're going to put in a little break there. Now let's save our script, go back to our browser, we're going to hit refresh. And as we can see, this time, all those ugly parts of the code we didn't want the user to see are gone. And this text is showing up just the way it should do. That's because this was outside these PHP tags, whereas this was inside the PHP tags. So it evaluated first of all the echo command, and then what the echo command does is it echoes any string to the browser. The string is a series of letters and numbers and symbols, whatever you like. It treats them as alphanumeric characters. In this case, it's hello world. And so that the PHP knows where the string starts and stops, we use these little inverted double quote signs to demarcate the string. Then at the end, we put a semicolon. The reason for this is that it may not seem very important in this script, because it's only one line, but as your PHP scripts get more complicated, you're going to be writing scripts with more and more lines, and each line represents a command. PHP needs a way to differentiate between the commands, so at the end of every line, we put a semicolon. That splits the line. So far, all our PHP script has done is nothing that we couldn't do just with HTML. Instead of writing echo hello world, we could have just written hello world in here and saved ourselves the trouble of all of this. So in our next movie, we're going to look at variables, and this is where PHP will start to get more interesting, more flexible, and more useful for us as server-side. Variables are one of the most basic concepts in programming. A variable allows us to give a name to a container for data without explicitly referring to what that data is. Let's take a look at an example. Let's start our PHP script with the open PHP tag, and then let's define our first variable. Let's call our variable name. Now in PHP, unlike other programming languages, we can define a variable and set its value in the same line. You'll notice that each variable begins with a $sign. This makes it very easy for us to pick out our variables as we look through our PHP script. To assign a value to our variable, we use this sign. This is sometimes called the equal sign, but in PHP, we're going to call this is set_to. So the variable name is set_to, and then we give it a value. So in this case, let's give it the value Joseph. We put that inside the double quotes to show that this item of data is a string, which means any set of letters or numbers. And then we close with a semicolon to show that that's one line of PHP. Now we're going to try to make sure that that variable has taken its value as we intend it. So let's echo that variable to the browser. We type in echo name, always remembering the $sign that precedes every variable in PHP. Another semicolon, and we close the PHP tags. We're not using the HTML tags and the body tags that we normally use. This is purely to save time. When you come to make your PHP scripts, you generally find that you want to use all the HTML tags so that your documents are formatted as valid HTML. Just to save time, we're going to leave that out for now. So let's save this as we did before to our document root, and we're going to put that in examples, and this one we're going to call test var.php. We save that. Now let's take a look at what that looks like in the browser. Once again, we type in the address using localhost, and let's see what that comes up with. It's echoed the variable Joseph to the browser. Now if we look back at the code, what it's echoed is not name, it's echoed the contents of that variable, the value. So name is the variable in this case, and Joseph is the value. Now we can change the value of a variable anytime. Let's try that. Let's add another line, and we're going to use the same format. We're going to type $name for our variable, and this time, let's say we're going to call this name Mary. And then we're going to type exactly the same line. Let's save that. And we'll go back to our browser, and we'll view it again by refreshing the screen. Now, what's happened here? We have Joseph followed by Mary. If we look back at our script, the reason for that, even though these two lines are identical, echo name and echo name, the reason that two different names are output is that every time we set the value of our variable, that $name stands for something different. So we can see that by using variables, we can make our scripts more effective, and it's starting to look a little dynamic. One final thing about variables that I'd like to point out is that you can use whatever name for a variable you want in your scripts. You can use a really long name and PHP will still correctly interpret it. There is nothing wrong with using a name like this, for instance, if you wish to. Of course, it makes more sense to use names for your variables that when you look back in your scripts, you are going to know what they mean. So the name variable is probably a better name than the supercalifragilisticexpialidocious variable if you want to be able to look back at your scripts and understand what you've written. Or even more so if anyone else is going to be looking at your scripts and trying to work out what you meant when you wrote them. However, you are free to use whatever variable names you wish. So we've introduced the concept of variables, and in our next movie we're going to take a look at operators and ways to use our variable. In this movie we're going to learn about some basic ways of manipulating variables, and we're going to introduce the concept of operators. First of all, let's look at the different kind of data that variables can hold. So far we've only seen string variables, that is, variables containing a series of letters or numbers or symbols that are treated as simply a string of text. Now variables can also hold numeric data, such as in this line of script we define the variable num to the value of, let's say, 13. And now let's have a look at this line. The number 13 is introduced as the variable's value. However, in a way that's different from the example we used in the last movie, there are no quotation marks around the value. This tells PHP that the number 13 is to be treated as a numeric value rather than as a string, the characters 1 and 3. Let's see how we use a variable like num. We can use the plus operator to add two numbers together, or numeric variables, or a combination of literal numbers and numeric variables. In this case, the number 7. Now let's save that. And we'll see what that looks like in the browser. the number 20. So PHP has correctly interpreted the variable num as the number 13. We could also use two different variables to represent numbers. In this case, the variable another, and replace the number 7 by the variable name. This would do precisely the same as the last script. So that's pretty simple then. The plus operator. The other operators are similar to how you may imagine. The minus operator. There's also a multiply operator, which may look a little different from what you're used to in maths. It's represented by an asterisk. And there's the divide operator, represented by a slash. The operators work pretty much as you may expect. However, there are certain times when there may be some ambiguity in our minds, but not in the minds of not for the computer. Take this expression: 4 plus 3 multiply 10. To us, that may seem an ambiguous expression. Which should we do first? Should we add 4 to 3 and then multiply the result, 7, by 10? Or should we do the multiplication first, in which case we come up with a different figure, 34? Let's try it out, and we'll see which PHP does. So we go back to our browser and refresh. We'll see PHP has opted to go for 34. Now the reason for that, even though the plus operator comes first, is that PHP looks at the whole expression and it chooses to do the multiplication first because the multiplication operator has precedence over the plus or subtract operators. Similarly, the divide operator has precedence over any plus or subtract operators. If we wished to make sure that the addition came first, what we could do is put in a pair of brackets. This would tell PHP that 4 plus 3 is to be treated as one smaller expression within the entire numeric expression that it's being asked to echo to the browser. Let's test that one out. We'll go back to our browser and refresh the screen. This time we get the number 70. So we can see here that the rounded brackets are a good way of forcing PHP to carry out operators with lower precedence first. We'll take a look in more detail at operator precedence later on. But for now, there's another operator of which you may not be familiar. And let's take a quick look at that and see what it does. It's known as the Modulus Operator, and it's displayed as a % sign. And what this does is it divides the first number by the second and returns the remainder. So in this case, it's going to divide 12 by 5 and return the remainder, 2. There's one final operator which we use very often in PHP, and this is not a numeric operator. This is a string operator. If we use our name variable again, and this time let's say the name is Peter, and we go down to our echo command, and we're going to echo the string my name is, followed by our concatenation operator. And concatenation is just a fancy word for running two strings together. So we run, first of all, these set of letters here together with our variable name. Let's save that. And the output, you'll probably be able to guess, my name is Peter. One final thing to say about the concatenation operator is that we can equally well concatenate numeric data such as 32. We use another concatenation operator, open quotes, make sure we leave a space after the quote, so that's treated as part of that string, and I am, we put in the age variable after another dot for a concatenation operator, another dot, years old. Make sure you include all the double quote signs that I've used there. Once again, we'll save that and refresh the browser view. And as we can see, PHP has treated the age variable just the same way as it's treated the name variable, and added it to the echo statement just as we requested. That's introduced operators, and in our next movie we're going to look at some more complex. In this chapter we're going to look at the ways in which PHP makes choices. We're going to write some scripts in which PHP will decide whether to go one way or another way within the script, depending on whether certain conditions are met or whether they're not. This will allow our scripts to be more flexible and allow for multiple outcomes depending on the data which is input. So first of all, we're going to look at the basic if statements in this movie, and we're also going to look at the conditional operators, which allow us to define the conditions whereby the if statements will choose one path or another within the script. We're going to look at logical operators, which will allow us to pair two or more conditions and allow the PHP script to only take one path if both are true or if either are true, and so on. We're going to look at else and else-if clauses. These allow for other clauses if the principal if statement is not true. We're going to look at switch statements, which is another way of making choices in PHP, and the other keywords that go along with switch statements. And finally, we're going to look at the ternary operator, which is a very concise way of expressing a conditional and making a choice within a PHP script. So let's get right in and write our first conditional PHP script. As always, we open our PHP tag, and let's define a variable called num with the value 7. Now here's how we use a conditional. We use the if statement, and then we use regular brackets, the regular rounded brackets. You'll find them on the 9 and 0 keys. And then we put our condition inside. So we're going to say if the variable num, then we're going to use a little symbol you may or may not have seen before, and this is the greater than symbol. We're going to put the number 5 in and close the bracket, and this here is our condition. So if this condition, being the variable num, the value of the variable num being greater than 5, if that condition is true, then PHP will want to carry out another statement. So in this case, let's say echo num is more than 5. Let's close our PHP script, and we'll save this into examples as conditional. Now, let's take a look at our browser, make sure the script works. As always, we use localhost to get to the right place. And as we can see, the answer has come out as we expected. Num is more than 5. Now, if we wanted to enclose more than one statement within the conditional here, we could use curly brackets like so. This means that anything that falls within these curly brackets is to be carried out if this statement is true. It's usually a good idea to indent. Now, whatever statement we put afterwards is going to be evaluated whether or not the condition was true. So in this example, save that. In this example, let's say the condition wasn't true. Let's say num was 2. Save that again. And let's take a look at what happens here. As we can see, this gets printed out anyway, is the only text that's echoed to the browser. The reason for that is that this condition is checked or evaluated, and in this case it evaluates to false because 2 is not greater than 5, and so this line, whatever comes between these curly brackets, is ignored, and the PHP will proceed to the next line, which is this line, and carry out only this line. Now, let's take a look at our condition, the operator that we used here. So far, we've only used the greater than operator. There are quite a number of different operators, however. There is also the equals operator. Now, this may look a little strange. It may look like I've made a mistake here. Why have I typed the equal sign twice? Well, as we learnt before, this sign in PHP and a lot of other programming languages is not considered an equal sign on its own. This is the is set to sign. That's because what it does is it sets the value of the variable to the left to the value on the right. If we want to compare two values and see if they're identical, then we have to use a double sign here, which is the equal sign. Let's see what would happen if we simply used the is set to sign. I'm going to add another line here to make sure it reads out the value of num. Now to look at this, if we were just to look at it and use our common sense, it would look like this will never get evaluated because this statement is not going to be true. However, we have to think a little differently in this case. Num is more than 5 and it's printed out the number 5. Now if we look back at our PHP script, we can see that apparently it evaluated this expression as true. Now how can this be? Well, the answer is that if we use the isSet2 variable operator, then PHP simply sets num to 5 and then evaluates the whole statement as true, even though it's within a conditional. So we must always remember, if we're going to use this equal sign as a comparison operator, then we must make sure to use the right format, which is the double sign. Otherwise PHP is going to interpret it as the isSet2 sign and we're going to end up with no end of trouble. This is a mistake that I've made so many times in the past, so if you find yourself making it a few times, then you're in company. Let's have a look at some more comparison operators. We've seen the is greater than, we've seen the equals, and we've seen the is less than, which is similar to the is greater than, but the other way around. There's also is less than or equal to. So say if the figure was, say if num was 5, then in this case, this condition will be true. However, if we simply use the is less than, then it will be looking for a number less than 5, and so the condition would evaluate to false. We also have, of course, the greater than or equal sign. And finally, we have the unequal sign. This will only evaluate true where num is not equal to 5. Okay, so we've had a look at some if statements, and we've had a look at the comparison operators that allow us to create conditions that the if statements can evaluate and carry out commands based on whether those conditions are true or false. To make more flexible and complex conditions, we can use the logical operators to combine two expressions and put them together as one condition. Let's have a look at our PHP script to see how that works. Once again, set a variable, and then we use our if statement as before. So in this case, greater than 20, and then we use our AND operator. This is represented by two ampersands. You can probably find these on Shift 7 on your keyboard. And what that does is it puts these two conditions together, or two expressions together, to form a condition. And in this case, we're going to pick out any age that falls between 20, so if the age is greater than 20, and 40, so if the age is less than 40. And we're going to say between 20 and 40. Let's save that, and we'll see if that works. So PHP has found the age, in this case 32, to be between 20 and 40. So what it does is it evaluates this half of the condition, and that's true, and it evaluates this half of the condition, and that's true. And because both of them are true, then combined together with the AND statement, then the whole condition is considered to be true. However, say if we take age 10 and we try that in our browser, then we can see that that doesn't work because that condition overall was considered to be false, even though this side was true. Even though 10 is less than 40, because it's not greater than 20, because this side evaluates to false, then the whole thing evaluates false. This is because the AND condition will only evaluate true when both sides evaluate to true themselves. There is a different condition that we can use to be a little more forgiving, and that is the OR condition. Now, you may have a little trouble finding those symbols on your keyboard, the straight up and down slash, of which we use 2 to represent the OR, logical OR condition. Sorry, the logical OR operator. On my keyboard, that's just above the Enter key. Mine's a standard American keyboard. If you use any other kind of keyboard, you may find that in a different place on your keyboard. So let's try this with our OR condition. And instead of using this, which is a bit misleading now, we're going to say either greater than 20 or less than 40 or both, because that's what our OR condition effectively means. So let's save that again, and we're going to go back here and refresh, and as we can see, the message comes up. So we can use our OR statement or our AND statement depending on whether we want to check to see whether both statements are true or whether either one statement or the other is true. There's one more operator that we can use. That is the NOT operator. So in this case, let's take out one of these expressions, simplify things. We use the bang or exclamation mark to represent our NOT operator. Then we enclose the expression within brackets so that PHP knows what we want to work out what is not true. So effectively, what the NOT operator does is reverses whatever we've put within that expression. So let's change this to not greater than 20. Let's see if this works. Not greater than 20. Yep, that's been carried out because 10 is not greater than 20. We can see that this statement evaluates false. However, when we add the not, then the condition as a whole will evaluate true, because the not operator basically reverses whatever answer this evaluation will come up with. So if this comes out true, it'll come out false. If this comes out false, it'll come out true. So if we took, for instance, the number 25, save that, we'll see that we don't get this statement. That is not our code, because 25 is greater than 20, so this evaluates true, and so the whole thing evaluates false. So that about sums it up for our logical operators, and we'll be seeing uses for these as we start developing more complex PHP scripts. In our next movie, we're going to look at the else statement and how that can make our if statements more flexible and useful.